Welcome to this last Understanding Ullswater talk for this year. We're hugely grateful that Geoff Cowell has agreed to come back again. There was a huge demand actually for him because he gave a talk, was it in 2017?
Yeah.
One of our first talks. This hall was packed. He talked, I think, for an hour and 15 minutes without stopping, and people were riveted. And it was quite extraordinary. I have no idea how long Geoff is going to speak tonight. He's extremely well known in this area. He's been a guide for many, many years. He has a long history as an educationalist. It's a great privilege for us to have him here tonight. This is Sequel, his second presentation. You see also behind me, for those who haven't seen it, our recent pop-up, so-called pop-up exhibition on our Understanding Ullswater Heritage website. Some of you in this hall have already contributed to it. I would encourage you all to look at it and to see whether you would like to make some contributions yourself. I think I should probably start. Is there anything more I need to say?
Maybe just to tell people who want to record.
Yes, now we're going to record. So for those online, if you don't want to be seen, turn your video off. We'll get it right this time, so we're going to hit the record button so that we'll have the entire duration of the call. Without more ado, I think I'll pass the floor to you, Geoff.
Okay, thank you.
Enjoy the event tonight.
Thank you. You probably realise that the slight factor at the start. I've not been Zoom before. I've given a lot of lectures in my life, but it's always been looking at the audience and looking at the screen, so it's getting used that way around. It's nice to see some of the faces again. When I gave my first talk, it was the first 500 million years of history of the formation of this landscape. There's not 500 million years after that left, so you have to make do with 1,000 tonight. But I thought we ought to start with some revision. Like any good lecturer, you want to make sure that in 4 years, people might need their memories jogging just slightly. And some of you probably wouldn't have seen the original talk. So I'll skip through this because it is revision. And the latest, a land carved from rock. And in many ways, this summarizes the slide I'm going to show you. 500 million years ago, approximately, the geological process has produced this landscape and lakes of great beauty and scenic beauty. And it does say then, I'll repeat it later on, slate developed from sediments in oceans and seas, volcanoes erupted, limestone was formed by the deposition of decrustations, and sandstone was created in desert conditions. And various minerals also formed in joints and faults in the bedrock. A lot of this will be familiar to you. The layer of rock formed was shifted and sculpted, first through different stages of folding and uplifting, and then by the actions of glaciers and meltwaters. The result, the topography of the Lake District includes smooth U-shaped valleys, got one down the road, and steep and sharp ridges like Helvellyn. And the longest lake, which is not ours, just down the road, it's Windermere, of course, it's the longest, not the deepest. And it's often compared to a wheel with a hub approximate to where dumbbell raises and things going out in all directions from that. But the story started 480 million years ago because where we were then was down here, or half of it was, that's most of England and Southern Ireland. There's Northern Ireland and there's Scotland. So where we are is in Avalonia, and where the top half is in Laurentia, and you'll see that we're about 60 degrees south of the equator. Now we've moved up from there to where we stood, or I'm stood, you're sat this evening, over 480 million years. And that's simply by movement of tectonic plates. To give you a very crude idea of how quickly they moved about the same rate as your toenails grow. Now, it does vary between Atlantic and Pacific, but that is a rough average. But over millions of years, if you didn't cut your toenails, it'd be pretty long. So this is why it has moved that far. So that's 480 million years ago, and things got moving down to 420 million. So in 60 million years, you can see now the two halves are getting closer and closer, and there's this sea now trapped, and there'll be all sorts of pressures in there as well. Then finally, 400 million years ago, there we are, where we are now. The whole of the United Kingdom is just part of Pangaea, this enormous supercontinent. And you'll see by now, we're on the equator. Because when we're on the equator, of course, that any sandstone and so on in this area will be formed. And as the seas closed, there would be, with land going under one tectonic plate going under another, there will be enormous heat generated and volcanoes. And so you get what's called subduction, where one plate goes under the other. Under the ocean, almost certainly, would be the first volcanic eruptions, and we get a series of little islands. Islands still in water until that sea disappeared altogether. And these volcanoes would have gone on for an awful long time, and one was usually referred to as a super volcano, which is one of the biggest ones, creating the very center of the Lake District. Other volcanoes created other mountains elsewhere, but this is just about our Lake District. Now I've gone and done it. Let me go back to need to be able to. Is it possible on the thing to, yeah, to put it back to? It needs to. If you go it from the slides, not news, it's start of. That's it. Thank you very much. I shall try not to do that again. So that's happened. Now, when the two bits join together, what's remarkable is the join is only just north of where we sat here. That's where the two halves join together. So if you're driving up from here to Scotland and you hear back creaking noises and the hole in the road, you'll get an idea that it's coming apart again. But this is where the join is. Now it's deep underground. In parts of Ireland, there actually, you can see in rock formations where the two halves went together. But here, it's not the iapetus suture. They're followed, and in the introductory slide, we talked about there being all sorts of activity, volcanic activity, and when those volcanoes formed, the land underneath them would be pretty plastic, and they did slowly sink back under the sea. And you can get sedimentary rock on the top of even Hell Valley. So sedimentary rock formed under seas. We've talked about sandstone, limestone, we talked about with crustaceans and so on. And this is the sort of picture you get on a lot of the guides to the Lake District. And you can see here, the blue isn't water, by the way, which is often misleading on this thing. This is limestone. And I've also often likened the Lake District to this hard center. This is volcanic rock, Borrowdale volcanics. We've got Borrowdale volcanics with slates around this top half here. So Skiddaw, as name implies, that's where the slates are in that part of the world. There are some elsewhere. And we've got sandstone around the edge. So it's circular, isn't it? When all the volcanic activity had finished and it was sinking on the water and came back up again, it was like an inverted jelly mold. So think of that on the tops of the mountains and low around the outside. So if this carried on around here, which is undersea, you could see in effect there's a series of almost circles here. And if you approach the Lake District, the first thing you see is walls made of limestone. and it's only in the centre that you'll see walls that aren't made of limestone because you use the local rock. You don't carry it out if you don't need to. And if you come up the M6 as I've done tonight, on the outside there, you'll see these mudstones, and these were the final bits. So various layers around the Lake District to give us that sort of structure. At the end of the day, what we talked about last time in great detail was the formation of different sorts of rocks, but you get the general drift of it. The first 480 million years was the busy time in forming the skeleton of the Lake District. Then we've had ice ages, which have then changed what was initially created. And over the last 2.6 million years, the Earth's been experiencing an ice age. You notice that I've not changed the tense. In a sense, it's still in one. Tonight, you may feel that I'm right. It's not very warm out there. But with fluctuation between hot and cold conditions, during cold periods of successive ice sheets, I mean, there's not just been one ice age, there's probably been at least 10 in that period of 2.6 million years. So there's been quite a few. Now, they've spread out from the centre, following the radial drainage patterns, back to my little story of all the patterns extending from the centre outwards. The most recent one, Lake Devonsian, at its apex, well, it started 26,000 miles ago. It's actually its apex about 22,000 years ago. And then the melt started. And there was a series of meltings, then a period of cold again, till the final one 10,000 years ago or thereabouts. And these were responsible for shaping, the final shaping before we got plants and trees or anything else in the Lake District. And it created this shape. Deep basins, stuff going right down as far as the Cheshire Plain, deposits of sands and gravels between the ice sheets, yes, widely used locally source of aggregates, and the outcrop of Borrowdale volcanic groups, polished surfaces. You can see them all around the Lake District where you get a polished mountain thing, big scratches in it. There's some in the lake. There's some if you go up to Coniston copper mines, some nice ones at the side of the track there. If you go into Grasmere and go up to Allen Bank, there's some beautiful examples of it along there as well. So good examples of this. And that's the effect of ice ages causing shaping. Then, of course, humans come along. And the oldest monuments in Cumbria date to the Mesolithic. Most of Cumbria covered in forest by 6,000 years ago, and human beings were around. The hunter-gatherers concentrated on the coast because it was easy. If all the centre was covered in trees, and it would be full of bears, wild boar, unfriendly animals, and so they lived mainly around the coast. We found examples of flint working sites. No flint in Cumbria, as far as I know. It's stuff that's been washed up the sea and found on the seashore that was used as the flint for this. And then in South Cumbria, there's evidence of charcoal burning and small-scale clearings found. So the earliest examples of humans around that time. Then in the Neolithic, the late back end of the Ice Age, there's more visible evidence of Neolithic activity, mainly finds of axes, presence of monuments, stone circles, cairns, few settlement traces, very few pottery finds in Cumbria compared with much of the rest of the country. And the change to the Mesolithic to the Neolithic in Cumbria is gradual and continual. But we see appearance of different shaped pieces of flint and ceremonial and funerary monuments. Just go back to the Bronze Age. Beginning of the Bronze Age, approximately 2000 BC, 4,000 years ago, It's thought that bronze weapons and tools really were brought over from the continent, and certainly the centre of much of this was the island of Crete. And one of the interesting things is if you examine the skulls from people in the Bronze Age to what it is in the Stone Age, there's a difference in skull shape, which would indicate that there were a different people emerging, and probably the ones who brought the bronze items over with them. Although later on, probably also farmers. And bronze, you need copper and tin. I've said they're both materials readily available. Well, copper much more readily available than tin, but both were available. An Iron Age from about 2080. I've not been consistent in using BC and VP, and I do apologise. I thought I'd edited it all correctly, at least say one or the other, and I've not. Not come out of for that. Both open and closed settlements. In the main, we think of Iron Age settlements as having enclosures around them. There's a time when there was open warfare between tribes, time when life was getting dangerous, and usually when we find, and it's not often we do find them, a site, a village, an old village site we've not come across before, the first thing you look at is there an outer boundary, because if there is, it's probably as late as Iron Age. If there isn't, it's possibly Bronze Age. You don't just take that, it's the first thing you look at before you investigate further. Agricultural settlements in valleys on lower fells, small hill forts constructed, we know the two around here, which is why I put them in, Maiden Castle and Dunmallard. They were mining for ore, probably on a very small scale at that time. But by that time, we started to clear forests, and this is the first sign of human activity destroying or altering the landscape of the time. And then the start of farming, first evidence of agriculture, more permanent settlements in the Neolithic, more forest clearance. During the Bronze Age, the climate was warmer, and it allowed for settlement on higher ground, and I shall come back to that theme later. And initially, crops were not grown. It was only animals that they kept, and the wives and daughters went out and foraged. There was this demarcation, men and boys would have animals, wives and girlfriends, we didn't have girlfriends and daughters would go out and forage. And the idea of agriculture technology needed to keep domestic animals to plant, harvest and process crops. That spread more slowly across Europe and reached the coast of France, built about 6,000 years ago. And then it slowly moved into this country. Started on the east coast, south coast, and probably the people who were farmers and wanted to introduce the rest of Europe to farming brought their seeds and so on with them, and I think this is probably why there was a difference in skull shape with many of the people found later. So they brought it, they slowly moved across this country. There might well have been copying as well. If you see the guy next door doing well, you want to follow his example. So it might not just be people moving, but a mixture of people moving with the technology and the seeds and other people wanting to copy. But more food meant more people could live in the same place for longer, so settlements formed. And we start with permanent boundary markings on land. So it's another change of the landscape. These first appeared about 4,000 years ago. And it's remarkable how many of those are still around. It's still there now. If you go up onto Mordivuk, this time of year, perhaps a little bit later, when the bracken's not covering everything up, and you can see them. And one of the books we recommend is it Cairns something on Fields that the association perhaps buy for people to look at, will list some of those barriers that were built. In this part of the world, none of them were more than the kilometre or so long, most less than that. But in some parts of the country, they were several kilometres long, and they're still there. You can still find them today. But agriculture, in the Iron Age, people lived in permanent houses. They weren't nomads anymore. Wentleys living. Farming land divided into fields and storing their harvest for use throughout the year. This is something that was different as well. It stored them in holes in the ground very often, not just a hole in the ground, but a well-defined and lined hole in the ground. And by the time the Romans arrived, large parts of southern England were already a patchwork of hedge fields with farmsteads and villages connected by tracks and droveways. But the downside is farming killed the wildwood. It's still happening, isn't it? We've been talking this week about what's happening in other parts of the world, because we're very keen to criticise them. Our ancestors did the same a few thousand years before, but that's conveniently forgotten. And the clearance of second millennium BC were on an unprecedented scale. Not so much up here, not so much in our part of the world as in southern England. But the estimate is that for every 30 people you need managed woodland of some 4 square miles to provide enough wood for houses, fencing stakes and wattles. So the wildlife is disappearing. And we saw the last of the aurochs, you know, the big cows with big horns, and their population crashed as well. So effect of agriculture. And there were setbacks due to climate change. Some of this I didn't talk about last time, but I think it's pertinent for what follows. But there were some bad weather intervals. Let me go back to that, press the wrong button. But between about 1250 BC and 1000 BC, there were warm, dry conditions. So that was for, 250 years, nice conditions. And people moved further up the mountainside, further up the fell side to their agriculture. And they got right up to something like 1,300 feet, you know, which is that's as high as some of our lower mountains in this area. But when the temperature dropped, they retreated down 800 feet. Doesn't sound that much, but if it means it's reduced the amount of land you've got available for agriculture, it means that you can't help the populations the same. It means you're going to start to get friction. Because if you own land up the fell side and you want to start and move down it, the people down it aren't going to be very happy. And on top of that, we have, as we've had in this country not that long ago, volcanoes erupting in Iceland. We can date that fairly accurately because it was possible to use dendrology, you know, tree ring analysis with trees they found from that time. And there's also a solar minimum for that period, 325 to 200. Now that's not man-made. That's where, because of the separate orbits of the sun and Earth around it, there are periods every so often when the sun is permanently slightly further away from the Earth than at other times, which means it's a lot colder as well. And there's certainly an increase in violence between family groups and tribes, which is why they started to put walls around their settlements. And there were an increase in defensive positions, and they're just a couple I quote. There were others as well, and there would be small fortlets built to help with this. And the second effect is to see move towards keeping more animals and less use of land to grow crops. Grain crops are particularly affected by colder, wetter weather. Still going on, isn't it? But there's also a move from small round houses to bigger homesteads. By the Iron Age, there were bigger rectangular buildings. And I wonder whether this is so they could huddle together to keep warm rather than worry about the temperature outside. So, but there were small round houses around, and they survived in use till at least 400 AD and possibly longer. There are some examples which are used throughout the whole of the Roman occupation here. Right, the Romans. You're the arrival of the Romans. Nearly got it right first time. When did the Romans arrive in Cumbria? Cumbria, there's no poster saying Romans first came here, so and so. We know that there were the things that we taught about at school. Julius Caesar invaded southern England in both 55 BC and 54 BC, but he didn't capture. They weren't fighting so much. They just came to have a look around and really start to do trade with southern England. And in the main, it worked fairly happily. And in fact, they made Cymbeline declared king by the Romans. very handy, you see, to have somebody to blame. It's all the king's fault. It's not ours. We're Romans. We're good guys. But eventually, Rome grew pretty tired of all the infighting. It's a bit like Parliament is now. You know, they can't agree, so there's a lot of infighting going on, and poor old Cymbeline was having a back time. So they eventually grew tired of the friction, and Claudius ordered 4 legions to invade and conquer Britain. So it's the first attempt to conquer Britain rather than to invade. And he invaded the fourth land of the Richborough in Kent, AD 43, captured Colchester and declared Britannia a Roman province. That's it, folks. You're part of Rome. It's a bit like being captured by Europe. They moved in most directions through Britain by AD 48. They got through most of England and Wales. They were about to subdue Anglesey when that troublesome lady, Boudicca, in the southeast, decided that she was going to teach the Romans a lesson. And there was a battle, and you know, she did pretty well in it to start with. There was a great deal of bloodshed, but it diverted the Romans from their expansion. And it set back the expansion northwards. But we know that lowland Scotland, the Romans were there by AD 78. I found no reference specifically to when they reached the Lake District. There was one somewhere, but if you can work it out, it's probably the year before, isn't it, at the rate they were going. But approximately AD 78, AD 77 is when they arrived here. And what changes did the invasion make to this landscape? Well, buildings, that's a change. As they moved northwards, it's easy to come by sea than it was by land. So they would come down around the coast, and Ravenglass, now Ravenglass, is where there's a nice harbour area, and they built a harbour facility and a fort. Eventually then, the luxuries of a bathhouse and the surrounding village for the families and the workforce, so they're going to grow wheat for them and all sorts of things. And the initial work was about AD 122, which is the same year as the start of Hadrian's War. So you can see there is a pattern in this. The dates make sense. And followed by more in AD 130. But what's interesting, that fort shows the results of the unrest that there was in the next 200 years. In AD 197, 296, 367, it's almost once a century, isn't it? There were fires there. And then from Ravenglass, they go up to Hardknott, we now call Hardknott Pass, to a fort, barracks, parade ground, bathhouses at Hardknott. And it was a sort of staging post on the way to Galava. You've probably all been there, you've probably all seen it. And you know how bleak it is on a day like today. Well, today's not been that bad actually, but that bleak it was for the last few weeks. It's pretty miserable. Just imagine a Roman coming and being dumped there. They wouldn't have thought much of the Lake District, would they? But it did alter it. And there would be, at any one time, about 500 troops there. And there is an inscription that shows the 4th cohort of Dalmatian men were stationed there, about 500 of them altogether. And there were parade grounds, they obviously did their drill there. And they moved on then to Galava on the shores of Windermere, modern Ambleside. And it's a sensible place to go because you've got good water routes where you could get around an area where at the time there would be nothing more than nasty tracks, or if anything. And so a sensible place to put it. Now, whenever the Romans got anywhere, they built a wooden fort first, and they would have done in the south of England as soon as they landed. I guarantee that within a week of the invasion, there would have been forts and men in them. There's no messing around. They knew exactly what they were doing. They had, in effect, a blueprint, modern term, of course. So the carpenters and joiners knew exactly how much timber they needed, various sizes, and they'd be off out into the local woods and getting the necessary wood to build the fort. So even if the locals were hostile, within a few days they'd have protection. Now, a few years ago, there was a national park project or fund a project to establish the evidence for the wooden fort beneath the remains of the stone-built one in Ambleside, Glarver. And I was fortunate to be one of the ones who got involved. It says pressing the wrong button again. We'll get it right eventually. And we were taught techniques of ground penetrating radar, magnetometry, and resistivity, the main three methods of checking for stuff underground. And it was marvellous really, as we were patiently using our various bits of kit and it was recording stuff in various ways. At the end of the day, the full-time paid archaeologist who was with us, and he'd spent his day job was going ahead of where they were building new roads to see what archaeology was being unearthed. And he would bring his laptop out, and by the end of the day, he could show us the first rough results of that day. Next morning, he would be working on it in his hotel room, and he'd come back and show us. It really was a fascinating experience to see that firsthand. I think most of that gets covered by. This is what we saw there. This is the main road going through past the site, Borham's Road here, to where you turn left then to go down the Langdale Valley. This is the site that you go around as a visitor. Roughly here is a barn and so on. Now you can see the different techniques used is why the patterns are slightly different. We use three different techniques, the ones I've listed, to get different parts of it. And wherever there is an anomaly, in other words, what they're finding underground is different to the bits around it, that shows up as a darker line and dots and so on. So you can see here, there really is something parallel that's quite striking. But here you can see this is all disturbed as well. Now he was better able to interpret that than I can here, particularly with a copy of a copy. But you see all round here is where the general population connected with it were living. So here's where the troops are, and here's in all the other areas around. So Ambleside was a big enough place then because of the Roman activity there. And this is what it was showing up. This is the outline of the stone-built one, and this is the outline of the wooden one underneath. And you can see it's even double-walled there. So that's the first evidence there was that there really was a wooden fort there, and there's the remains and foundations of it. So quite nice, National Park patronage to be able to go and play like that and get some stuff out of it. And then the route for the Roman road. You're probably most of you familiar with this as well. Looking down that way with Froswick and Eelbell and the path you take to get to those. There is this branching off one going in this direction, and that is the Roman road. Only one bit of it's ever been studied properly with teams of archaeologists. Yeah. And that was done, they created it on that. Put it on that, did I? But it's, was it the bottom of the slide before? Let's not worry too much. It has been looked at by geologists some years ago now, and there's one section of it that was dug up so that one could see, and it was a traditional drains on either side, cambered road, stones down the side, just a short stretch of it. Now it's not quite on the route that you walk along, it's to the, I shouldn't say left of it as you walk along, but it is on the left hand side as you walk along that track in the direction you're looking now. Then you get to Broome, there's a castle there which is much later on, but there is sign of the Roman fort in this foreground here. And that was built AD 78, 84, that fits in with and reaching here about AD 77 and up to Scotland and 70. Again, you see, it was built almost as soon as they got there. My guess is it would be wooden first and then stone afterwards. Near a crossroads, still a crossroads if you think of the 66 and so. And that road's been there for a lot longer than here. I mean, there was a road or a track all the way from, in parts of Yorkshire, all the way down the Langdale Valley, so that the Yorkshire people could come with their money, when money is other goods, to swap for hand axes. And so this road would have followed that same track. So really, the A66 follows a road that's thousands of years in use. And this is a bit more of this. Doesn't show very well on this, but it just showed the old Roman burial ground there, Roman fort here, and this would have been bits associated with where the locals were living. Then we get to Hadrian's Wall. I can't quite claim it as the Lake District, it's only up the road, and it certainly changed the landscape. I don't know if you can read that, it's tiny than I wanted. The wall's placed slightly north the existing line, but it's still between the Tyne and the Solway, and is carefully chosen by the Romans to make best use of the existing topography. There's some nice outcrops of rock and so on. Why build the wall if nature's already provided something? It's surveyed from each end now towards the middle, and the building started in the east, where the road from the south near street met the wall, and where later a gate, the port gate, was erected. It was first planned that most of the wall to be built in stone, but the eastern 30-mile section is being turf. But in front of both of them, it would matter if stone or turf, there were substantial ditches made, and then the various protective mile castles and other towers. And interesting, some looking inland, they were at times a bit more afraid of the locals causing trouble at the wall than they were of people, the Picts, you know, the Scots, the other side of the wall, coming down to cause trouble. So that gives you an idea, and most of you have probably been in a local wall in any case and probably know this quite well. But there was a bit of a change of plan, and this tells you what sort of plan was. Hardly matters the detail of it, but one of the key things really is that there was clearly a lot of activity through the wall because of the number of gates and the width and so on that they needed. But after the forts, rather, the width of the wall was narrowed to about 8 Roman feet, 2.4 meters. And many people believe the standard of craftsmanship was reduced. It looks as though they were speeding up. There was probably trouble the other side of the wall and need to get it finished sooner, but the craftsmanship didn't appear to be quite as good. I'm going to do something again. Thank you. A typical mile fort along the thing, again, you've probably seen them, big enough to have a few people there keeping their eyes open. And you see, you can actually walk straight through that. So that might well have been one of the approved routes. And when you look at it from the air, you can see how detailed Housesteads is and what a big setup it was. So without a shadow of a doubt, the Romans did make quite a lot of difference. At the very end at Maryport, there were other Roman buildings, a fort, even though you see the outline there, and I think you probably just about read that. Roman tombs there, so a burial site. I was able to work there as well, not with a national park, and I worked on one of those Roman buildings round about here. It was a villa, and I spent a little time working there. And for me, the great pleasure of working on that bit was, it's where by chance we found underneath the villa the remains of a Bronze Age settlement. So again, it's the reusing of land that had already been used. Now, AD 130, just after the wall was built, this is an illustration of the defences that there were around. Here we've got Ravenglass, and it's a lovely little harbour, you see. When you're in Ravenglass, it's not as quite so clear, I don't think, that it's quite a nice harbour, good defensive place, and the route have suggested Hardknott, Gallava, then up the wall to Broome. You see, there was a road down to Troutbeck. That's the one that's just south of the A66. Up to Carlisle and all these roads. I think that's dotted because it's not entirely certain that that was made at the time of AD 130. But all these little defensive fortlets all around the coast. Now, when you look at where it's pointing to Ireland. And they were defending that coastline from invaders from Ireland. They'd come in handy later as well, probably for when the Vikings turned up at the door. Well, you could go on for days about Roman history affecting this part of the world, but I think I've said enough to illustrate that in fact there was a change to the landscape. There were roads built, there were massive buildings, a lot more people came in, it changed the landscape. And there would have been a demand for food. They couldn't have brought it all in from Rome. There would have been a demand for food. And that would have been grown locally, probably by local people making a living doing it. I've not seen any evidence to say how much or where the market was, but a talk I was sorting out for a walk I was doing around Chipping area and a Roman settlement there. And even one of the fields there is called, or village is called Wheatley, to show that in fact they're all wheat fields. And that wheat was being grown specifically for the Roman fort and for the Roman army there. And I've said, I think earlier, that this wasn't against the background of peaceful coexistence with the indigenous locals. And there were problems all over the empire, the Roman Empire that is, compounded by local unrest caused the Romans to frequently dispatch soldiers elsewhere and eventually leave completely to defend Rome itself. And you probably are mostly familiar with this structure. It's over 400 years. Eventually, it petered out rather than the big exodus. And it was really officially by AD 410 that Rome officially broke with Britannia. And most parts which had been formerly occupied were already effectively independent of the empire. In other words, the locals were more or less running them in any case. Some of the Roman forts were used still, like local government offices and habitations. And I think it's Oswald where there was some evidence of local occupation until at least the 6th century. However, what was interesting is in areas, not necessarily just around here, where marvellous Roman buildings were left deserted, and the indigenous people didn't just squat in them. They allowed them to fall down and then rob all the stone to build outhouses and things like this, and lived in wooden buildings themselves. It's incredible, really, hard to believe. And yet, you know, going to Ambleside, and I mean, I've had the pleasure of being taken out there by somebody who does know what he's talking about in buildings in Ambleside, and he was able to point out oldish buildings in Ambleside where the foundations are certainly from dressed stone taken from the fort at Gallava. I mean, why not use it? It's there and it's beautifully dressed. It's better than doing it yourself, isn't it? But it's strange. You really would think that people have taken it over. But roads were not repaired, buildings were robbers told, and a loss of the consumer function, a loss to the local economy as well. So people would be less well off than when the Romans were there. Most of the power vacuum, if that's the way to put it, was being filled by local warlords. I mean, they were fighting when the Romans were there. But we're not talking about big armies. We're talking about little cohorts of people, a gang of villagers, half a family, or whatever it is, fighting each other over land, possessions, and anything else they could. And barbarians north of the wall. But the raids in about the 360s are capturing cattle and slaves. And one of the things we do forget is that slaves were big business at this time of the world. nice blonde-haired English slaves have been carted off to Rome almost as exhibitions. And here, slaves are being traded. And one of the other interesting things about this time is the Welsh getting involved as well. They were Celtic tribes as well. And one of the traditions which intrigues me is, let me go back. Yeah. The Welsh tradition has the Cowell hen, which in Celt is old Cowell, was an important figure in the Roman provinces of northern Britain. Now, it's also believed this is the old King Cole of the nursery rhyme. Now, if you think well, how could it have survived that long? The legends of Arthur were at the same time. So if one can survive, one can't the other. So this is old King Cole, probably involved in that area. And he was certainly an important figure in an area that covered everything between the Humber and the Tweed, it says on that. And it's the last leader of the Britons, and as such would have commanded the army in that region. And until the mid-500s, there was only occasional ranging from outside the country. In other words, most of the trouble was the locals fighting amongst themselves. The raids again concentrated on stealing goods, mainly cattle and slaves. And slavery became an international market at this time as coinage non existed. And St. Patrick, it's believed, the legend is, was captured as a slave, taken by Irish pirates, possibly at Ravensgrass. And did eventually manage to escape, get back to Rome, and then back to preaching in this area. Again, it's repeating some of the same stuff, but a mention of reggae there. Reggae, it was a reality, but there's certainly some debate and dispute of whether the kingdom of reggae was actually such. Reggae, a region, was important, and so on. And all this led to little change in the general landscape. I was saying earlier that deforestation is used an increased indication of increased farming production. And it did. And if you look at pollen records, it was at a steady level in post-Roman Cumbria. The rest of the country, it had gone on throughout Roman times at amazing pace. Where there had been clearance, the sort of things that were being grown were flax, hemp, cereal cultivation, and it appears there was a buoyant population, the term used in terms of numbers, and they enjoyed a period of hospitable climate from about 100 BC, after all the things I mentioned earlier had finished, up to the end of the 6th century. And it's estimated that a typical July day then would be 1 degree higher than now. Now, that never sounds much, but in the conference we've been listening to from up the road, we're only talking about 1.5 and 2 degrees. So it's a significant change. It was warmer. The end of the 6th century, our pollen records show a quite dramatic decline in human activity. Now, there was visitation of the plague about 547, and if it killed off a lot of people. It killed off, I mean, COVID, piece of cake compared to this, but then we had the advantage of jabs. If we hadn't had the advantage of jabs, I wonder how many deaths there might have been. But then there was nothing, just superstition, and you've perhaps been naughty if you've got the plague. And up to a quarter of the population, something a third of the population could have died during these outbreaks. So there was a decrease in activity. That would have helped some regeneration of trees and other wild activities. But then with 7th century, we saw the rise by the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria. And that the extent of that Anglo-Saxon settlement has always been a matter of some contention. The trouble is, this is the so-called Dark Ages. The Romans had kept good records of everything. They were meticulous in keeping records. After they'd gone, records became very thin on the ground. And it wasn't until the ecclesiastical scribes started recording history that you got some idea, because they were a bit biased. You know, if somebody popped by their monastery, slaughtered half of them and went off with the gold, you're not going to write that up as very favourably towards the people that have suffered. So difficult to get a true idea. And the extent of Anglian or Anglo-Saxon settlements in Cumbria is still unclear. You see, it looks very much as though English occupiers concentrated around the rich agricultural land. Areas such as Cumbria, upland areas of Germany may not have been affected as much as the lowland one. Place names give evidence of being people present. And the Victorians and later, been a lot of examination of place names to give them the clue as to the people there and where they settled. And it's suggesting here that Anglian names are found in the low-lying areas around the Highland, modern Lake District. These regions are more fertile agricultural, and many became parishes or townships in later times. And most of these have names you'll be familiar with: the Ham and Ingham, village or homestead, Ascombe as an example. Most come in the form of tun, farmstead, village, settlement, examples of which include Barton, Bampton, Broughton, Workington on the coastal area. You'll be familiar with far more than that little list. But after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Celtic people in the area gave themselves the name of Cumbria, is the one we're perhaps most familiar with, meaning fellow countrymen, from which the name Cumbria eventually derived. Now again, we return to Reged. So the history we have available suggests that in the 6th century, Urium became the ruler of the kingdom of Reged. Well, I've already said earlier, it's not entirely certain it was actually a kingdom as such, but this is what is supposed. And the boundaries of it were roughly equivalent to the boundaries of modern Cumbria and Dumfriesshire and bits of Yorkshire. It's not just Cumbria, it was a bigger area than that. And then the start of many pacts, and this went on for quite a long while. Around 730 AD, Bernicia united the kingdom of Deria to form the kingdom of Northumbria, and Celtic Reged was annexed to Northumbria as well. So all those three became the Northumbria. And the Cumbric language then gradually became replaced by Anglo-Saxon, so it wasn't overnight. And many of those old Celtic names have survived, and you'll be familiar with many of those places as well. You'll also be familiar with about the only counting that's done with Celtic numbers that any of us know about is shepherds counting sheep. And you can probably rehearse it off by heart as well as I can, at least the 1 to 10. I may not know what it is at the 10. And so as a bit of a summary, the spread of the German people, I've used the term German people to cover anybody that was in that Anglo-Saxon thing, because they all came from those Germanic areas. But what's interesting, many of the soldiers in the Roman army are from what is now called Germany. And when they retired, many settled here. They simply stayed. If they and the family had lived around here for the duration of military service, they're not going to want to move. They stayed. And they were given grants of land and money when they retired. They were fairly well looked after. They survived. And when soldiers were sent back to Rome to deal with the insurgents, their replacements were often from the German tribes. Ironically, some of the insurgents were from the Germanic tribes as well, in Rome itself. And German and Frankish tribes preyed on merchant ships off the northeast coast from the 3rd century. You see, there's a lot going on over this period of a few hundred years. And after the Romans had left for the first 4 decades of the 5th century, there's a large influx of settlers from across the North Sea, often referred to as Saxons, but they were from different coastlines ranging from right down the Rhine right up to Jutland. And this caused a fair amount of conflict with the native Britons. They're never sure what they call Britons, Celts, or whatever. The natives didn't sound quite right. And that didn't abate until there was a set-piece battle, Mons Britannicus, probably in Dorset, in about the year 500. And then there was a period of relative peace for about 50 years. Things seemed to settle down. But those Germanic tribes were not interested in just staying on the East Coast. They come to this country for a better life. They were, in a sense, the original illegal immigrants. And they wanted here to make a good life here, have land, most of them were farmers. And they started their trek west. And from the other side, we've got the Irish also moving to come over, and a lot of those settled on the west coast as well, near to where I live, down in the Liverpool area, quite big settlements there as well here. So it's a time when a lot of people from all over Europe were moving in different directions. It really was a time of great change and movement. I'll have to practice. Thank you very much. You were very kind. Now, just a little bit on the Anglo-Saxons, because they did leave something. We talk about settlements from there in about the 5th century, but they had two things which we've inherited in a way, not so much with land. And again, you see a typical Anglo-Saxon house doesn't look very different to what an Iron Age one would have done. And this was after the Romans had gone. And this is the sort of thing they did. But one of the things they're keen on is the possession of land and the way it was distributed. And it was very much a social institution as much as anything else. And the system tended to be called Mark, even though I've not heard it called that very recently. Twofold meaning attached to it. First, a division of territory belonging to the settlements originally developed by tribal kindred. And secondly, the legal jurisdiction of public law, written or understood. So it's the first signs of the being of laws that apply to the whole of the population of those areas. In other words, it's the start of English law as we think of it now. And this is the time, really, when it started rather than Roman law. I don't want to catch it at the same time, but I wish I didn't. Thank you. The land in the Mark belonged entirely to the community or tribe, whatever you want to call it, and they annually allotted the arable land amongst themselves, which is an unusual approach. In other words, it was done as fairly as could be done. And the common rights, I don't know if this really is the origins of our commons now, but there were common rights, because there's the forest and meadows at the centre of Mark. The centre of Mark was a clearing where they established a settlement for farming. That was enclosed by the thick belt of forest, so it was a clearing in the forest or waste, which signified the separation of boundaries and acted as a natural bulwark against other communities and rivals. But the forest was under the protection of their gods, the Anglo-Saxon gods, and its sanctity must not be violated. In other words, they had, of their own wish, through their own religious beliefs, this feeling that that must be preserved. Ironically, it's the encroachment of Christianity which eventually destroyed some of that, and they cleared more of the trees out of the way. It's not often you hear religion being used as an argument for a change in the way land's used, but this would appear to be the case then. And this certainly shaped the local landscape. And the 7th to the 10th century, the 300 years, saw rival claims from Scottish and Anglo-Saxon kings for sovereignty over much of Cumbria. You know that went on a lot longer than that. I passed a board on the way as I drove up here talking about the last battle with Scotland in 1745. So, I mean, that was a fair time later than this, another 1,000 years later. But again, was it a legend? The death of the last king, Dunmail Raise, there's that enormous cairn there, which is always claimed to be the burial place of that king. There certainly would have been a battle somewhere, and lost in that battle to Edmund I. And well, I had a house in Grasmere for a time, so I know exactly where it is, and you probably all do as well. Well, after they sort of not gone, but are still here. But now the Vikings begin to take the stage. And they'd started raids already on the coastal monasteries like Lindisfarne in 789. And that was written up by probably a somewhat biased monk who was not happy about what had happened. But the Cumbria area later underwent further settlement by successive waves of Anglo-Saxons and Viking people. So further Anglo-Saxons coming in, more Viking people as well. Victorian scholars, in trying to find out where some of these people settled, where they came from, began this process recording in detail through the Cumbrian study in Icelandic or Norwegians visiting Coniston, just how many Scandinavian words survived in place names. If you want to know if it's Scandinavian, that's a Scandinavian is really the theory. Fell, Dale, Beck, Gill, all of them. They began to look carefully at eroded figures on Cumbrian crosses. I've got some examples of those in a minute. And by the end of the 19th century, some traditional Cumbrian dialects seem to be close to Old Norse and modern English. And finally, and I don't know how many, we just outside Penrith, aren't we? 20 years or so ago, Penrith was revealed to have the highest concentration of Scandinavian DNA in England. So if you're from Penrith and were born in that area or brought up in that area, you've probably got more than the normal Scandinavian DNA. I've got 2% in mine, which is fairly common. That's fairly common around the whole of this country. So if you've got much more than that, you're probably from that area. There was a series of programs on BBC 20 odd years ago, and as usual, they do a book after the series. If you've not read it, The Blood of the Vikings, the BBC Two publication, it's worth having a read to see what was done. Quite a fascinating thing. I've got a copy of it. I think mine personally signed by the author as well. But for more than a quarter of it, it seems that our times 40 male ancestor was from Norway. So if you watch your football, maybe if you're in Norway as well as England from time to time. And yet, this had never been how all Cumbrian historians have described our area. Roman, yes, partly the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria, perhaps, even partly Scottish, or partly Welsh-speaking kingdom of Cumbria. But nothing in the historical record, and very little dug from the ground, suggested this being a Norse area, and yet it was. Scandinavians settled almost every valley in the lakes, from Bosdale, shows the derivation of the name, to Ullswater. Does it still say Ullswater on your signs on the side of the lake? I've forgotten. It was a while since I read it. They left no records. They were probably illiterate. It seems, however, that the Norse who came here was no longer only Viking pirates, although may have continued seasonal raiding. In fact, one of the images one likes to see, I think, is a longhouse, Viking longhouse. They come home, they sow their corn, they get the lambs and so on, and then they go off doing a bit more raiding, and they come back next time when it's time to get the harvest in and so on. So, you know, multi-purpose living is probably what has happened. But they did come to settle and bring their families. They were derived from farmers, and they took over small upland farms. They get pigs, cattle, sheep, possibly herdwigs. They coppiced ash trees to feed their livestock, and anybody who's been on my walks around areas where there's ash trees always point out this most valuable tree in any village at that time, because you use the foliage to feed the animals, and even the ash is usable. The society really looked almost like a democracy, and they liked, and it still goes on traditionally in the Isle of Man now, for the communities to get together in assemblies on mounds called the Thing Mounds, but they also kept slaves. I mean, slavery is a feature of several thousand years of activity, and it's a bit sad really that we've got modern day slaves in this country with here. And if they like their Icelandic cousins, they could be quick to take advantage, fiercely independent, obsessively litigious, and were fond of killing each other. So, you know, quite nicely, it was really. But the Vikings bestowed many distinctly Norse place names: Streamsden, Becks, waterfalls of Forces, Norse Foss, Thorpe. Read those for yourselves, and you'll be probably very familiar with those. But to be a slightly different, it's a bit like Ullswater, named Buttersmere, but there are other possible interpretations of that place name. And looking down on what were typical Viking field layouts, see, they've not got quite the same straight walls as how the later fields. These are probably fields laid out after enclosure acts. These wiggly fields surrounding little farmsteads and so on, but they did have structure like this. That's one in Little Langdale, one of the mounds. But then for signs of where they'd been, I don't know if you know this church, Victorian Church of St. Michael's in Workington, destroyed by fire. But there was archaeological investigation took place, which you couldn't have done if there hadn't been the fire. And most of it is found to be disturbed by burials, which is not uncommon. But they did find a substantial collection of Anglo-Scandinavian sculpture. Some of it even been incorporated in medieval and later fabric. Small numbers of metalworking items. So it suggested that there probably was an Anglo-Scandinavian settlement in that area. And this is one of the crosses in there. You can see a Celtic style wheel on one side of it. And the Viking tree, the ash of life on the reverse. That's unfortunately not as clear as the first slide is. So suggesting two cultures recorded and memorized on the one object. And the Gosforth cross as well, that wasn't erected till the 10th century, but it's got a lot of very elaborate carvings on it. And they've been interpreted as representing characters and scenes from Norse mythology. They depict Jesus and with other Norse mythological characters. So it's designed as well after the cross design, the Christianization of Ireland. But again, it's an illustration of probably people with different religions and cultures being clearly living together quite happily. Other Viking bits and pieces, some of these you'll recognise, and the giant Sun Penrith, the four sides of it, and depicting the scenes there. And the Hog's Back at Lowell, which is not a bad example of one, and the giant's grave in Penrith. But that, strangely enough, is an extremely good example of a Hog's Back carved piece of rock, and that's in Haitian, little church along in Haitian, and quite remarkable. Rosemary and I were there some months ago, and the church warden, I think it was, knew the story of that piece of rock, quite remarkable. Well, the final chapters of Viking rule. Harold Hardrada, Norwegian king, believed in a legitimate claim on the English throne. And so in 1066, he sailed for England with a large fleet. This is not the one from the south, this is the one to the north. Entering the Ouse and up to York, where he took the English by surprise. Went up to Fulford, where he engaged with a hastily gathered group of English earls and beat them up. And the Norwegians entered York. But the goodies, as far as most of us are concerned, the English king, Harold Godwinson, had set off north for the battle, but was late for it. That first battle had already taken place. But he moved, and I think most of you learned this from your history lessons at school, he moved very quickly with his troops, marched them at a fair old rate, and they were amazed to find that he got that far north. He took the surprise at Stamford Bridge, and the Norwegians found themselves trapped in the river valley, cut off from their ships. battle lasted all day. Incredibly, the battle lasted all day. I mean, we haven't gone for 5 years. And they had a battle in a day to sort things out. The Hardrada was slain. The Norwegians broke ranks and tried to run back to the ships, and of course there was a great massacre. And there's said there were 330 ships. I mean, some people say no, it was more like 100 and something, not 330. And only 24 of those managed to survive to get home. Now, William of Normandy had been waiting to cross the Channel with his army from the south for a while. And a bit like other invading forces, Spanish Armada had a similar problem, didn't they? The weather changed to suit this when he finally got going. He landed at Pevensey, and he had 17 days into which to dig in his men before Harold could march back again. You know, that's not normally recorded. It sounds as though, you know, Harold turned around and was there the next day. He got quite a long time to get dug in. The battle lasted a whole day, another whole day's battle. But when Harold fell and the English broke ranks, allowed the Normans into the kill, and yes, they did. And thus the Viking period ended and the Norman ones began. But were they Vikings? And so, was William the Conqueror French? We like falling out of French, don't we? I always know the use French. But nothing gives us more pleasure than to find that French is not fishing. It asked them, was he actually French? And, you know, there's some doubt he was really Viking. Because a few years before, when the mainly Danish Scandinavians were fighting Franks in 911, the French king allowed them to remain in the lower Seine Valley in return for defending the approaches from Paris. He couldn't trust his own troops, but he knew if he paid the Vikings, they'd be loyal to you. So other Scandinavians eventually joined that little group, and there's this hybrid community which Duke William became leader. And it's he and his followers who invaded England in 1066. So they're not French at all. They're actually Vikings and the descendants of Vikings. So both sides, really, in the Battle of Hastings, were more or less descended from the same stock. So, and it really was an aristocratic land grab. When he arrived, there's something between 4,000 and 5,000 Anglo-Saxon estates. But after the invasion, land was divided up by the conquerors. There were just 144 estates in the hands of Norman barons. So it gives you an idea of the massive size of those handouts. If you're a mate of him, you did very well out of that invasion. The total influx of invaders is estimated a few tens of thousands, but it's estimated only 2% of the total population. So only 2% of the population owned just about 100% of the land. And Latin became the language of government, and the aristocracy spoke Norman French. Laws have changed. But what I'd like to summarise and finish on is this, that most of the changes that affected the landscape here actually complete by the end of the Iron Age. Certainly the Romans structurally made a big difference. They built roads, they have buildings, they have big settlements, and there will be a demand for food, which would have increased the production of food because it was going to be sold to the Romans and of animals as well. There would have been an increasing amount of timber felled for all of that. But when the Romans went, a lot of that would have regenerated again. So unintentionally, there would have been some regeneration. I mean, when we look around the Lake District now, there's only a tiny fraction of the tree cover that would have been 6,000 years ago. And there were changes. There were changes in the way land was used, and probably 90%, I think, of the changes in our environment were complete by the end of the Iron Age. And it's only the last 10% in the sense of change that I've been talking about this evening. Well, I hope you found some of that of interest, because that's the end of it.
I was keeping my eye on the audience to see who was dropping off. And only one was just a little bit. You've kept everyone going for an hour and a half, more or less. But it's just an extraordinarily rich presentation, like before. I think you've captured everyone's imagination. We've got new stories to tell about the Norman invasion and our own culture. I don't know what percentage of Scandinavian DNA is in me, but maybe it'll provoke me to do the analysis.
It's only cost about £99.
Right. I don't know how much time people want to spend. Questions? Do we have any questions from the floor? I'm sure. Or from those on Zoom.
Ask them to unmute themselves if they want to.
You.
If you unmute yourself if you'd like to speak and just put your hand up.
Alan.
I was wondering what we feel is the ideal amount of forestation now in the Lake District, or let's just say around Ullswater. Are the trees mostly those of people with big gardens? Or are there any forests or what?
Well, there were a lot of coniferous trees planted after the Second World War as a cash crop. Most of those have either been felled or will be shorter. They were there as a timber crop. As they're being felled, they're being replaced by local trees, the trees you'd expect to grow in this sort of area. I probably housed in it as well. A lot of other volunteers have planted tens of thousands of trees in Cumbria in the last 20 years, and probably before that as well. I mean, there have been projects where, 5,000 trees planted in an area, maybe more than that. People have even donated their own land for woodlands to grow. Trying to think of the name of the little village now. This one off the side of the road round the lake shore with a landowner. I'm sure there was some cash incentive for it, a government grant or something, where he had several acres of land that he wanted to create as wood. There was funding available for the bare-rooted wood, and a group of us would go along. All you need is a spade and a slot, bang it in the ground, stamp your feet on it, put a pole in, toss it in ground, tie wrap. I could still do it now, probably in my sleep. And it's surprising how many trees you can plant. In less than a week, we planted 5,000 trees. Now, they were all ones we believe should be in this area. And so the ones that came up after the ice ages, like oak, beech, so sycamore, not keen on, French introduction, elder, ash probably not doing too well at the moment either. If it was fine, Scottish pine trees, that's fine, etc. Trying to think what other trees you did. Juniper. Yeah, juniper. A whole range of trees. So wherever you see woodland being chopped down now, have a good look at what's gone, and you'll find 99% of it is fir trees that were of one sort or another. They were planted as a cash crop. Look at what they're putting in their place. They usually leave it a few years before they plant anything new. Look for the plastic tubes, have a peer down the top if you can get in, and you'll find that the trees we would like to see here. It'll take a while.
This morning I was at the COP26 in Glasgow, and while you were talking, I was trying to think, what is going to happen to the face of our landscape, sort of the greening move which is happening at the moment. And you refer to the speed of change when the Romans came, and then long periods when there was very little happening. And as you were talking, I was trying to think what's this place going to look like? Because there's no doubt the landscape isn't fixed.
No.
You know, there's going to be changes happening all the time. And even we know here in Ullswater, there's a resident population of about 2,000. There's about 500,000 people who come every year.
Yeah.
What impact are they going to have, and how are we going to sort of structure our lives so that we can cope with that enormous flux of people coming and going all the time?
Yeah.
And if you came back in 50 years' time, what would you be talking about then?
Well, that's right. Still digging coal.
I hope not.
But I was born in a coal mining village, you see, so I know quite a lot about coal mining, and how none of my family wanted any of their children, including me, to go down the coal mine. And none of the families I knew in the village wanted their children to go down a coal mine. Sometimes it was a necessity.
Are there any questions from our Zoom audience?
I don't think so.
Are there any more questions from the floor here? We have about 40 people in the room. I'm really pleased to see such a good, healthy audience.
It's very
for your
nice.
talk.
Very nice, very enjoyable.
Any
We have
more?
about 40 online as well.
Yeah.
Well, more than 40 individual devices.
Perhaps we should have another round of applause for your fantastic. Maybe one or two things just to say at the end. This is our last talk for this year.